You cannot even afford a car, so shut your damn mouth, my dad sneered during the Thanksgiving dinner. Right then, the helicopter landed on the lawn. I smiled. My ride is here. My dad froze. Mom fainted. My name is Sydney, and at 32 years old, I never expected my own parents to treat me like a parasite while they were secretly living in a house I owned. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to toxic family members who completely underestimated your worth. The crisp November air bit at my face as I stepped out of a basic Uber in front of my family historic brick home in Cascade Heights, Atlanta. This neighborhood was a symbol of generational wealth and pride for Black families in the South. For my parents, Gerald and Brenda, it was their entire identity. I paid the driver, tipped him generously, and grabbed my simple canvas tote bag. I purposely wore a plain beige sweater and dark jeans. I was the founder and chief executive officer of a global financial technology firm, but to my family, I was just poor, little single Sydney who worked a boring desk job and could not afford a luxury vehicle. That was exactly how I wanted it. I preferred peace over performance, but peace was never an option in this house. Before I could even take off my coat in the foyer, my older sister Jasmine marched around the corner. Jasmine was 34 years old and the undeniable golden child of the family. She was dressed in a silk designer jumpsuit that I knew she bought on a high-interest credit card. Without a single word of greeting, she aggressively shoved a thick piece of paper directly into my chest. I caught the paper before it hit the hardwood floor. It was an invoice from an elite catering company in Buckhead. The total printed at the bottom was $5,000. I stared at the paper and then up at her perfectly contoured face. I calmly asked her what this invoice was for. "It is your share of the Thanksgiving dinner," she snapped, crossing her arms defensively. "You did not help cook, you did not help decorate, and you showed up in a humiliating rideshare car where all the neighbors could see you. Preston and I handled the imported French wine and the premium meats. The least you can do is cover the basic catering cost, since you are eating our food today." Before I could point out the absolute absurdity of paying $5,000 for a dinner I barely wanted to attend, my mother Brenda swept into the hallway. She adjusted her expensive pearls and looked me up and down with absolute disgust. "Do not start causing drama the minute you walk through the door, Sydney," my mother scolded. Her voice dripped with that familiar condescension I had endured my entire life. "Your sister and her husband are doing incredibly well. Preston is a very important hedge fund manager, and he expects a certain standard of elegance for the holidays. We cannot have you ruining the aesthetic with your cheap attitude. You are 32 years old, unmarried, and taking an Uber to a family holiday. You owe us this much just for embarrassing us in front of the community." I took a deep breath, forcing myself to remain completely calm. I looked past my mother into the formal dining room. I could see the spread on the long oak table. The so-called $5,000 catering was nothing more than frozen macaroni and cheese from a bulk warehouse store dumped into my late grandmother Crystal's serving dishes alongside a dry-looking turkey. "Last year, I woke up at 5 in the morning to cook everything from scratch," I replied, keeping my voice steady and even. "I paid for all the groceries myself, and you threw my entire tray of homemade gravy into the garbage can because Preston said he was allergic to black pepper. Now you want me to pay $5,000 for frozen side dishes just so Jasmine can pretend she is hosting a luxury event for her social media followers." Jasmine dramatically gasped, placing a hand over her chest. "Mom, tell her to stop disrespecting my husband. Preston is a provider. He brings actual wealth into this family, unlike her." My mother immediately stepped closer to me, her eyes narrowing with anger. She pointed a manicured finger an inch from my face. "You will pay that bill, Sydney. You have no mortgage, no husband, and no responsibilities. You just hoard whatever pathetic little salary you make while your sister is out here building an empire with a successful man. Quite frankly, it is pitiful that we even have to ask you to contribute. You should be begging to help elevate this family instead of acting like a stubborn child." I looked at the invoice again. I knew for a fact that the catering company listed on the paper belonged to one of Jasmine's close friends. She was not asking me to pay for dinner. She was trying to scam me out of $5,000 to cover her own shopping debts while using a fake invoice to do it. The sheer audacity of the manipulation was breathtaking. They honestly believed I was stupid enough to just hand over my hard-earned money out of guilt and shame. I folded the paper neatly and slipped it into my pocket. "I am not paying for this," I said flatly. "Not a single cent." My mother's face turned a violent shade of red. Before she could start screaming, another voice echoed from the top of the grand staircase. It was heavy with arrogant amusement and carried an undeniable tone of white savior superiority. "Well, well, well, who is crying now?" Preston descended the grand staircase slowly, making sure all eyes were on him. He was 36 years old and dressed like he was attending an exclusive country club regatta instead of a family holiday dinner in Atlanta. He wore a crisp pastel blue button-down shirt tucked perfectly into beige chinos and expensive leather loafers without socks. His blonde hair was meticulously styled to look effortlessly casual, and his smile was a calculated weapon he used to disarm everyone in his path. The rhythmic tapping of his shoes on the hardwood floor seemed to demand immediate respect from everyone in the room. He walked up behind Jasmine and wrapped his arms around her waist, resting his chin affectionately on her shoulder. He looked at me with a sickening mixture of pity and amusement. "Now, Brenda, there is no need to yell at Sydney," he said smoothly. His voice had that practiced, steady calm of a man who firmly believed he was the smartest and most rational person in any room. "We all know she does not have the kind of disposable income we do. It is not her fault she chose a dead-end career path while Jasmine chose to build an empire. We should be patient with her." My mother immediately softened her rigid posture the moment Preston spoke. The anger vanished from her face, replaced by sheer adoration. She practically beamed at him, adjusting her pearls again. "You are just too generous, Preston," she cooed. "You always try to see the best in her, even when she is being completely unreasonable and ruining our Thanksgiving with her bitter attitude. I just do not understand why she cannot be more like you two." Preston chuckled a deep, patronizing sound and released Jasmine. He reached into the inner breast pocket of his tailored blazer and pulled out a sleek, dark leather checkbook. He clicked a heavy gold fountain pen and leaned over the marble kitchen island. He made a grand theatrical show of writing out the check. The scratch of the metal pen nib against the thick paper was loud in the sudden silence of the room. He tore the check from the book with a sharp, deliberate rip and slid it across the cool marble directly toward me. "There you go," he said, flashing his perfectly white teeth. $5,000 made out directly to Jasmine Catering Contact. Consider your debt completely paid, Sydney. I do not want any bad blood on a holiday. Family is too important to fight over a few pennies." I looked at the check sitting on the counter. A few pennies, he called it. To the average working person, $5,000 was 2 months of rent or a lifeline in an emergency. To Preston, it was merely a prop for his massive ego. He desperately wanted to look like the benevolent white savior swooping in to rescue his poor black in-laws from their own petty squabbles. It was a role he played constantly, and my parents ate it up every single time, ignoring the subtle disrespect hidden beneath his charity. "Thank you," baby Jasmine purred, kissing him dramatically on the cheek. "See, Sydney, that is what a real man does. He provides for his family, and he protects his wife. Maybe if you fixed your awful attitude, you could find someone to take care of you too, instead of struggling alone in some tiny apartment." I left the check untouched on the cold marble island. I kept my hands relaxed at my sides. "I do not have a debt to cover, Preston," I said, my voice completely level and devoid of emotion. "I did not order that food. But if you want to throw away your money on frozen macaroni and cheese, that is your choice, not mine." Preston's smile tightened for a fraction of a second before returning in full force. He leaned casually against the counter, crossing his ankles. "Let us not be proud, Sydney," he said patronizingly. "We all know how much you struggle. Taking the public bus or riding in cheap ride shares cannot be easy on you, especially at your age. In fact, I am feeling particularly giving today. He reached into his front pocket and pulled out a polished silver money clip thick with cash. He slowly peeled off 5 crisp $100 bills, making sure I saw exactly how much he was holding. He walked over and laid the cash right on top of the $5,000 check. "Here's a little extra for you," he said, his tone dripping with fake sympathy. $500 in cash just for you. You can use it to buy some decent clothes, or maybe put it toward a down payment on a reliable used car. A Toyota, or a Honda perhaps. Something practical for your situation, so you do not have to rely on strangers to drive you around. I stared at the cash. Preston never gave away money without a heavy string attached. He was a hedge fund manager who calculated every single return on his investments. He did not do charity. $500 in cash was not a gift, it was a bribe. "What is the exact catch, Preston?" I asked, simply tilting my head. Preston laughed loudly, as if I had just told a hilarious joke. "No catch at all." "Sydney," he insisted, holding his hands up in mock surrender. "I just want to help out my little sister-in-law get back on her feet. Oh well, there is just one tiny little favor you could do for me after dinner. Nothing major at all. Just a minor legal document that needs your quick signature. Just some old family estate paperwork Gerald and I are cleaning up for tax purposes before the end of the year. It will literally take you 2 seconds to sign, and then you can take the cash and go enjoy the rest of your evening." The trap was finally set, and it was so transparent, it was almost insulting. They wanted me to sign away something highly valuable in exchange for $500 and a cleared fake debt. They were banking heavily on the assumption that I was so desperate for cash that I would blindly sign whatever they put in front of me without reading the fine print. They genuinely thought I was financially illiterate. I looked past Preston to my father Gerald, who had just walked into the kitchen from the hallway. He was avoiding my eyes, staring intently at the floorboards and nervously rubbing his hands together. My mother was holding her breath, waiting for me to take the bait. Jasmine was smirking, convinced they had already won the game. I slowly reached out and picked up the $500. Preston's smile grew wider, a triumphant, greedy gleam flashing in his eyes. He thought he had bought my total compliance for the price of a cheap television set. I looked at the crisp green bills in my hand, feeling the texture of the paper. Then I placed them gently back onto the counter, right next to his gold pen. "I am going to have to pass on your generosity, Preston," I said, keeping my voice soft but firm. "I do not sign legal documents without reading them thoroughly first, and I certainly do not accept pocket money from men who lease their luxury sports cars." The room went dead silent. Jasmine's smug smirk vanished instantly. Preston's face flushed a deep, angry pink as the casual insult landed directly on his fragile ego. I knew for an absolute fact that the pristine Porsche sitting in the driveway was not bought with his successful hedge fund money. My company data algorithms had flagged his highly questionable credit behavior months ago, but he did not know that I had access to that kind of global financial information. "Are you completely crazy?" my mother hissed, breaking the suffocating silence. "He is offering you free money, and you are disrespecting him in my house. You are so hopelessly ungrateful, Sydney." "It is fine, Brenda." Preston interrupted, his voice noticeably tighter and higher than before. He was trying incredibly hard to maintain his cool, sophisticated facade, but I could clearly see a thick vein pulsing furiously in his neck. If Sydney wants to be difficult and refuse a generous holiday gift, that is her problem. We will discuss the estate paperwork at the dinner table where Gerald can explain it to her properly. Maybe she will finally listen to her own father. He grabbed the $500, snatched it off the counter, and shoved it back into his pocket forcefully. He left the $5,000 check on the marble, though leaving it as a silent, mocking reminder of his supposed financial dominance over me. "Dinner is served," Jasmine announced loudly, desperate to break the heavy, uncomfortable tension settling over the room. "Let us go into the formal dining room before the food gets cold." She linked her arm tightly through Preston's arm and shot me a venomous glare before leading him away. My mother lingered for a brief moment, shaking her head at me in sheer disgust and disappointment. "You are a massive fool, Sydney," she muttered under her breath, before turning on her heel and following them out. I stood alone in the large kitchen for a moment, taking a slow, deep breath to center myself. The smell of the frozen turkey was beginning to waft through the house, mixing with the scent of expensive perfume and cheap lies. They thought they were leading a naive lamb to the slaughter today. They had absolutely no idea they were sitting down to dinner with the butcher. I adjusted my plain beige sweater, smoothed out my jeans, and walked calmly toward the dining room, ready to see exactly what minor legal document they were so desperate for me to sign. I walked into the formal dining room and took my usual seat at the far end of the long mahogany table. The room was suffocatingly hot and smelled of artificial cinnamon candles and roasted meat. My father Gerald was already standing at the head of the table holding a large carving knife, like a king holding a scepter. He wore a tailored suit vest that stretched too tightly across his stomach. He was beaming proudly at Preston, who was sitting to his immediate right in the seat of honor. Jasmine was seated next to Preston, glowing with self-satisfaction. My mother Brenda took her place to the left of my father. I was placed closest to the kitchen swinging door, exactly where they wanted me. "Now, before we begin eating, I want to propose a toast," my father announced, raising his crystal glass. He did not even glance in my direction. "I want to toast to the man who made this incredible spread possible. Preston, my boy, you have truly brought a new level of class and sophistication to this family. When I think about where we started and where we are now with you guiding our financial future, I am just overwhelmed with gratitude. You are a true visionary." Preston chuckled softly and swirled the red wine in his glass. He tipped his head modestly. "It is my absolute pleasure, Gerald," he said smoothly. "I always say that rising tides lift all boats. When I succeed, my family succeeds. That is just how I operate." My father nodded vigorously, his eyes shining with pure admiration. "Exactly right," he agreed. "We are incredibly blessed to have a brilliant mind like yours at the table. Sydney, go to the kitchen and get the extra napkins, and bring out the ice bucket for Preston water. His glass is getting warm." I stared at my empty plate for a brief second. I was not a guest at this dinner, I was the unpaid help. I stood up without a word and walked back into the kitchen. I grabbed the linen napkins and the silver ice bucket. When I returned, my mother was already chiming in on the praise parade. "I was just telling the ladies at the country club about your new investment strategies, Preston," my mother said, leaning forward eagerly. "They were all so impressed. It is so rare to find a man who understands the global market the way you do. You have given Jasmine such a beautiful life. We never have to worry about her future." Jasmine reached over and stroked Preston's arm affectionately. "He works so hard, Mom," she purred. "Sometimes he is up until 3 in the morning analyzing stock trends and taking calls from overseas clients. It takes a massive amount of intellect to manage millions of dollars for high net worth individuals. Not everyone can handle that kind of high-stakes pressure." She shot a pointed look down the table directly at me. "Some people cannot even manage a basic savings account, let alone a global portfolio." I set the ice bucket down next to Preston and placed the napkins on the table. I took my seat in silence. The irony of their conversation was physically painful. They were worshipping a man whose hedge fund was currently bleeding money out of every pore. My company's stealth tracking systems had already flagged his firm for massive liquidity issues and severe client withdrawals. He was not staying up until 3 in the morning analyzing brilliant stock trends. He was staying up in a cold sweat, trying to figure out how to cover the massive holes in his fraudulent accounting. But here at the dinner table, he was the reigning king of finance. Preston took a slow bite of the dry turkey and chewed thoughtfully. "You know," Gerald, Preston began, wiping his mouth with a linen napkin, "the market is shifting very rapidly right now. There are some unprecedented opportunities opening up in the venture capital sector. Huge returns for those who have the liquid assets ready to deploy immediately. We are talking about tripling initial investments in less than a year." My father stopped carving the meat and leaned in, hanging on to every single word. Is that right? He asked, his voice breathless with greed. Tripling the investment. That sounds incredible, Preston. It is incredible, Preston confirmed, leaning back in his chair and steepling his fingers together. But it requires aggressive action. The big players are moving fast and consolidating wealth. I have been putting together a private venture capital fund specifically designed to capture these high-yield tech startups. I already have several major institutional investors begging to get in on the ground floor, but I have been holding off on finalizing the paperwork. Why is that, Preston? My mother asked, her eyes wide with curiosity. Preston sighed heavily, looking around the table with a perfectly practiced expression of familial devotion. Because I want to keep the wealth inside the family, he said softly. I want to give you and Gerald the opportunity to be the primary equity holders in this new venture. I want to build a legacy that will take this family from merely comfortable to undeniably wealthy. But we have to move quickly. The window is closing. My father's face lit up like he had just been handed a winning lottery ticket. He set the carving knife down, completely forgetting about the food. That is the most generous thing I have ever heard, Preston, he said, his voice trembling with emotion. We are absolutely in. Whatever you need from us, you just say the word. We trust your financial genius completely. Jasmine smiled smugly, picking up her wine glass. We knew you would see the vision, Dad, she said. Preston has been working so hard to make sure this family never has to struggle again. We just need to pool our resources together today to secure the initial capital. It is a foolproof plan. Preston reached down beside his chair and lifted a sleek leather briefcase onto his lap. The metallic click of the latch's opening cut through the heavy silence in the dining room. He reached inside and pulled out a thick manila folder. With a smooth, practiced motion, he opened the folder and extracted a crisp stack of legal papers. He did not hand them to my father. Instead, he slid them directly down the length of the long mahogany table. The papers glided past the crystal water glasses and the silver gravy boat, stopping exactly inches from my plate. I looked down at the bold black letters printed at the top of the first page. It read, "Quitclaim deed." I felt a cold knot tighten in my stomach. I knew exactly what a quitclaim deed was. My grandfather Theodore had left me a 25% ownership stake in this historic Cascade Heights home when he passed away. He had bought this house in cash during the height of the civil rights movement. It was his pride and joy, a symbol of Black excellence and resilience in the South. He had specifically put my name on the deed alongside my parents because he knew they were financially irresponsible. He wanted to ensure I always had a piece of my heritage to fall back on. Now Preston and Jasmine were trying to strip that security away from me right over the Thanksgiving turkey. Preston leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table and tenting his fingers. It is a very simple administrative procedure, Sydney, he said, his voice dripping with that familiar, condescending patience. As I mentioned, we are pooling our assets to secure the initial capital for the new venture fund. Gerald and Brenda have graciously agreed to take out a maximum equity line of credit on this house. It is a brilliant financial move on their part. Unlocking debt equity to create liquid capital is exactly how the top 1% builds generational wealth. Jasmine took a delicate sip of her wine and smiled at me. We are finally leveling up, she added smoothly. But because your name is technically on the deed along with Mom and Dad, the bank needs your signature to release the funds. You are just signing over your minor share to Mom and Dad, so the loan can go through smoothly. It is just a formality, really. A formality, I repeated softly. You want me to sign away my inheritance, my quarter of our grandfather legacy, so you can hand the equity over to Preston. My father slammed his hand flat on the table, causing the silverware to rattle against the china. Do not use that disrespectful tone with him, Gerald barked, his eyes blazing with sudden anger. Your grandfather left you that share because he wanted you to contribute to this family. Well, this is your chance to finally contribute. Preston is offering us a seat at a table we could never reach on our own. He is elevating our wealth and securing our future. All you have to do is sign a single piece of paper. I looked at my father, feeling a profound sense of pity mixed with disgust. He was so desperate to be perceived as wealthy by his country club friends that he was willing to blindly hand over the only real asset he had left to a man he barely knew. He had completely bought into Preston's illusion of grandeur. "And what exactly do I get out of this transaction, Preston?" I asked, keeping my eyes locked firmly on his pale face. "If I sign away my equity to fund your new venture, what is my return on investment?" Preston laughed, a short dismissive sound that grated against my nerves. "Well, Sydney, you do not actually have any capital to invest, so you will not be an equity partner in the fund," he explained, as if he were speaking to a slow child. "But as I said earlier, I am a generous man. Once the first round of returns comes in next quarter, I will personally buy you a reliable used car, and we can probably arrange a small monthly stipend for you so you do not have to struggle so much with your rent. Think of it as an allowance for playing along." My mother nodded enthusiastically from the other end of the table. "You see how well he takes care of us?" she chimed in, her voice high and desperate. "He is treating you like his own sister Sydney. You have absolutely no use for a quarter of a house you do not even live in. You are just holding us back from achieving our true potential. It is incredibly selfish of you to sit there and act like you are losing something when Preston is handing you a perfectly good car and free money." I stared at the quitclaim deeds sitting on the table. The sheer audacity of their plan was staggering. They wanted to steal hundreds of thousands of dollars in property value from me in exchange for a used car and a pathetic monthly allowance. They honestly believed I was desperate enough and stupid enough to fall for it. But the darkest joke of all was something they did not even know yet. They could not take out a loan on this house because they no longer owned it. My financial firm had quietly purchased the property out of foreclosure 2 years ago after my parents secretly defaulted on a previous loan to pay off Jasmine's massive credit card debts. The deed sitting in front of me was completely worthless because I was already the sole legal owner of the entire estate. But I could not reveal that card just yet. I needed them to dig their hole a little deeper before I buried them in it. I picked up the document and slowly flipped to the second page. My eyes scanned the legal jargon Preston had drafted. It was predatory and ironclad, designed to permanently strip me of any future claims to the property or any potential profits. "I am not signing this," I said, my voice steady and resolute. I placed the papers back on the table and pushed them away from me. "I will not give up my share of Grandfather House to fund a venture capital pipe dream." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees in a single second. The fake smiles vanished. The polite pretense evaporated. My father's face twisted into an ugly sneer. He stood up from his chair, tossing his linen napkin onto his plate. "You ungrateful little brat!" he shouted, his voice echoing harshly off the dining room walls. "You have been a disappointment since the day you were born. Your sister went out and found a man who can provide for us, a man who actually understands how the real world works, and you sit there in your cheap clothes acting like you know better than him. You are an anchor dragging this family down." Jasmine slammed her hands on the table. "You are ruining everything, Sydney," she screamed, her perfect composure breaking. "You are doing this just because you are jealous of me. You have always been jealous that I have a successful husband and a beautiful life, while you have absolutely nothing." Preston did not yell. Instead, his face turned a dangerous shade of red, and he leaned heavily on the table, glaring at me with pure, unmasked hatred. "You are making a massive mistake, Sydney," he warned, his voice dropping to a low, threatening whisper. "You do not understand the kind of money and power we are talking about here. You are a simple office worker who lives paycheck to paycheck. If you do not sign that paper right now, I promise you I will make sure you never see a single dime from this family ever again. You will be cut off completely." I looked at the three of them standing over me like a pack of rabid wolves ready to tear me apart for a few scraps of meat. They were threatening to cut me off from a fortune that did not even exist. I reached for my water glass, took a slow, measured sip, and set it back down on the table. I looked directly into my father's eyes and let the heavy silence stretch until it became unbearable. "I am not signing it." I said, my voice breaking the heavy silence in the room. I will not put my name on that quitclaim deed, and I will not give up my legal rights to this house so Preston can gamble with our grandfather legacy. My father slammed both of his hands onto the mahogany table. His face was contorted with a kind of rage I had only ever seen him direct at me. You have always been a small-minded girl, he spat, his words dripping with pure venom. You work a meaningless little desk job pushing papers for people who are actually making a difference in the world. You have absolutely no concept of what it takes to build an empire. Grandfather Theodore left you that share of the house because he thought you would grow up to be somebody. But look at you, Sydney. You are 32 years old and you have nothing to show for it. You are actively choosing to hold this family back from true generational wealth just because you are too stubborn and too ignorant to understand high-level finance. My mother stood up, clutching her napkin to her chest as if she were in physical pain. It is a sin, Sydney, she wailed, her voice trembling with theatrical grief. The good book says to honor your father and your mother, but you do nothing but disrespect us. We gave you a roof over your head and fed you and clothed you, and this is how you repay us. By being a selfish little parasite. You sit there drinking my water and eating the food Preston paid for while you actively try to destroy your sister's future. God is watching you right now, Sydney, and he sees the wickedness in your heart. You are a bitter, jealous woman who wants to drag us all down into the mud with you. Jasmine crossed her arms and glared at me, her eyes wide with fake disbelief. I literally cannot believe you are doing this on Thanksgiving of all days, she said, shaking her head. We invite you into our beautiful home, and we try to include you in a massive financial opportunity, and you just throw it back in our faces. You are so toxic, Sydney. This is exactly why you do not have a husband and why nobody wants to be around you. You just drain the life out of everyone. I sat perfectly still, letting their words wash over me like dirty water. Years ago, this kind of coordinated emotional attack would have crushed me. I would have cried and apologized and signed whatever they wanted just to make the yelling stop. I would have sacrificed my own security to buy a few fleeting moments of their conditional love. But today, their insults felt completely hollow. I looked at my father wearing a suit he could barely afford to impress a son-in-law, who secretly despised him. I looked at my mother weaponizing her religion to justify stealing her own daughter's inheritance. They were not powerful figures of authority. They were just desperate people drowning in their own financial incompetence and trying to pull me under with them. Listen to me very carefully, Sydney, my father said, leaning so far across the table that his tie dipped into the gravy boat. You are going to pick up that pen and you are going to sign that paper right now. If you refuse, you can get up and walk right out of that front door and never come back. You will be dead to this family. I will completely disown you. You will not get a single dime when your mother and I pass away, and you will spend the rest of your miserable life entirely alone. He thought the threat of disownment would terrify me. He thought the idea of being cut off from their toxic dynamic was a punishment. I slowly leaned back in my wooden dining chair and rested my hands in my lap. You cannot disown me from a fortune that does not exist, Dad, I said calmly. And you cannot use the word legacy to cover up the fact that you are begging me to bail you out of your own bad choices. How dare you speak to your father that way? My mother shrieked, stepping toward me as if she wanted to physically strike me. We have sacrificed everything for you. Everything. And you refuse to make one tiny sacrifice to help your family secure its future. You are dead weight, Sydney. You always have been. Preston held up a hand, signaling for my parents to stop yelling. He wanted to play the rational mediator again. Let us not get overly emotional, Gerald, he said, keeping his eyes locked on me. Sydney is just confused. She does not understand how venture capital works. She thinks we are trying to take something from her when we are actually trying to give her a piece of a massive pie. Right, Sydney. You are just afraid because you do not understand the math. I am not confused. Preston, I replied, my voice completely flat. I understand exactly what is happening here. You need liquid capital to patch up the bleeding in your hedge fund, and you convinced my parents to hand over the only tangible asset they have left. You are using terms like equity and venture capital to make it sound sophisticated, but at the end of the day, it is just a cheap cash grab. And you, Dad? I shifted my gaze back to my father. You are so obsessed with looking wealthy that you are willing to risk the roof over your head. Grandfather Theodore worked with his hands for 40 years to buy this house. He did not buy it so you could leverage it to fund a rich white man failing business. My father's face turned a dangerous purple. He grabbed the heavy silver serving spoon and threw it furiously across the room. It smashed against the vintage floral wallpaper, leaving a deep dent before clattering to the hardwood floor. "Do not you ever disrespect Preston in this house," he roared, spit flying from his lips. "He is twice the man you will ever be. He is saving this family. You are nothing but a pathetic, ungrateful failure. If you do not sign that document, I will personally call the police and have you escorted off my property for trespassing." I looked at the three of them, trembling with rage and entitlement. They had played all their cards. They had used guilt, shame, religious manipulation, and outright threats. They had pushed the emotional abuse to the absolute boiling point, expecting me to finally break. But the heat did not break me. It only forged my resolve into something harder and sharper. I was done being the silent victim in their grand delusional play. It was time to start dismantling their perfect little world piece by piece. I turned my attention away from my father and focused entirely on my sister. Jasmine was sitting there with her arms crossed, looking incredibly pleased with herself. She thought she had won. Sitting on the empty dining chair right next to her was her prized possession. It was a bright orange leather handbag that she had been showing off since the moment I walked through the front door. She claimed it was an authentic Hermes Birkin bag that Preston had bought her as an early anniversary gift. She had spent the first 20 minutes of my arrival making sure I knew it cost more than my entire annual rent. I reached out and poured myself another glass of water. My hand was completely steady. I took a sip and set the glass down against the linen tablecloth. "That is a very interesting bag, Jasmine," I said, keeping my voice conversational and light. "You said Preston bought it for you from the boutique in Buckhead, right?" Jasmine immediately puffed up her chest and patted the orange leather affectionately. "Yes, he did," she said, her voice dripping with pure arrogance. "It is a Birkin 35 in Clements leather. There is a 2-year waiting list just to be offered the chance to buy one, but Preston has incredible connections. He knows the store director personally. It is an investment piece, Sydney. Something that actually appreciates in value, unlike your cheap canvas tote bag sitting in the hallway." I nodded slowly, leaning forward just a little bit. "It is funny you mention investments," I said, resting my forearms on the table, because anyone who knows anything about high-end luxury investments would immediately recognize that the bag sitting next to you is a terrible counterfeit. The smug smile dropped off Jasmine's face instantly. She pulled the bag closer to her body, as if I had just threatened to steal it. "You are so violently jealous," she spat, her eyes narrowing. "You have absolutely no idea what you are talking about. You could never afford to even walk into a luxury boutique, let alone recognize a real designer piece. You are just making things up to deflect from the fact that Dad just put you in your place." I did not raise my voice. I simply pointed at the bag. "Real Hermes bags are entirely hand-stitched, using a specific technique called saddle stitching," I explained methodically. "Every single stitch is slightly angled. But if you look at the white thread on your handles, the stitching is perfectly straight, indicating it was done by a machine in a cheap factory. Furthermore, the hardware on a real Birkin is either palladium or gold-plated, and it has a significant weight to it. Your hardware is excessively shiny and has a slight brassy undertone, which means it is basic alloy metal. I can also see from here that the blind stamp behind the strap is entirely the wrong font size." My mother gasped and placed a hand over her heart. "Sydney, stop this ridiculous lying right now," she scolded. "Preston makes 7 figures a year. He does not buy his wife fake bags. You are just trying to embarrass your sister because you are bitter. Preston shifted uncomfortably in his chair. His face was starting to look slightly pale. Now, Brenda, let us not get worked up, he said, his voice lacking its previous absolute authority. Sydney is clearly just lashing out because she is embarrassed about her own financial shortcomings. We should just ignore her. I ignored Preston and kept my eyes locked on my sister. Jasmine was staring at her bag, and her hands were slightly trembling. The worst part is the smell, I continued relentlessly. Even from across the table I can smell the distinct chemical odor of polyurethane treatment. Real Clement's leather smells rich and earthy. Yours smells like a discount shoe store. Shut up, Jasmine screamed, her voice cracking with sudden panic. She grabbed the bag and shoved it onto her lap, hiding it under the table. You are a liar. Preston bought this for me. I have the receipt and the authenticity card. Hermes does not issue authenticity cards, Jasmine, I stated flatly. They never have. So if you have a card, that just proves my point even further. But you already knew that, did not you? Because Preston did not buy you that bag. You bought it yourself. My father frowned, looking back and forth between Jasmine and me. What are you talking about, Sydney? He demanded. Of course Preston bought it for her. He is her provider. I tilted my head and smiled a cold, hollow smile. She bought it herself, Dad, I repeated. She bought it 3 weeks ago from a replica website based overseas, and she paid exactly $450 for it. I know this because she used her Capital One Platinum credit card to make the purchase. The same credit card that currently has a balance of $14,000 and is 90 days past due. Jasmine's face drained of all color. She looked like she had just been slapped across the face with a brick. Her mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. That is a complete fabrication, my mother yelled, standing up from her chair. Jasmine does not have credit card debt. Preston takes care of all her expenses. She lives a life of absolute luxury. Does she? I asked, raising an eyebrow. Because according to public financial records and aggressive debt collection protocols, Jasmine has maxed out 4 different credit cards in the last 6 months. She owes $14,000 to Capital One, $9,000 to Discover, and another $12,000 to American Express. They have already moved her accounts to third-party collection agencies. She is drowning in debt trying to keep up this fake rich housewife aesthetic for her social media followers. You are hacking into my personal information, Jasmine shrieked, tears of sheer humiliation finally springing to her eyes. She pointed a shaking finger at me. Dad, she is illegally spying on me. Make her stop. Make her get out of this house right now. I am not hacking anything, I said, keeping my tone perfectly even. When you default on multiple lines of credit, your debt gets sold off and it becomes a matter of public record for any financial institution that runs a basic background check. I work in the financial sector, Jasmine. Information is literally my job. It is not my fault you are leaving a massive paper trail of financial ruin while pretending to be wealthy. My father looked at Preston, expecting him to immediately shut down my claims and defend his wife's honor. But Preston was strangely silent. He was staring at his half-empty wine glass, his jaw clenched so tightly a muscle was ticking in his cheek. He knew Jasmine was in debt because he was in even deeper debt himself. They were 2 broke people pretending to be millionaires and building a house of cards that was rapidly collapsing right over the turkey and cranberry sauce. Preston, tell her she is lying. My father pleaded, his voice losing a bit of its aggressive edge. Tell her Jasmine does not have $35,000 in credit card debt. Preston cleared his throat and avoided my father's eyes. Gerald. It is complicated, he muttered softly. We have some assets tied up right now, and Jasmine had some unexpected personal expenses. It is nothing I cannot handle once the venture capital fund is approved. My mother let out a small, choked gasp and sank back into her chair. She looked at Jasmine's cheap orange bag with a sudden horrifying realization. The perfect illusion was starting to crack, and the reality bleeding through was ugly and desperate. They had built their entire identity around being better than me and wealthier than me, but the truth was finally out in the open. Jasmine was not a high society elite. She was a woman carrying a plastic bag filled with past due notices. I watched my sister wipe a tear of pure rage from her cheek. She was breathing heavily, looking at me with undisguised hatred. She wanted to scream again, but she knew any more lies would only make her look worse. The silence in the dining room was deafening, replacing the loud, arrogant boasting from just 10 minutes ago. I had not yelled, I had not cursed, and I had not thrown any tantrums. I simply held up a mirror to their pathetic lies and let them destroy themselves. But I was not finished yet. I turned my gaze from my sister's tears to my brother-in-law's perfectly styled hair, ready to tear down the rest of his fragile facade. I looked directly at Preston, who was suddenly very interested in smoothing out a microscopic wrinkle in his expensive chinos. "You know, Preston," I said, breaking the heavy silence, "I find it incredibly fascinating how you talk about venture capital and liquid assets. You talk a very big game for a man who does not even own the car sitting in our driveway." Preston's head snapped up, his eyes darting toward the front window, even though the driveway was not visible from the dining room. "I have no idea what you are talking about, Sydney," he said, his voice tight. "That Porsche outside is a symbol of the hard work and dedication I put into my firm. It is the result of long nights and strategic investments. You would not understand the kind of vehicle a senior executive requires to maintain a proper image." I nodded slowly, resting my chin on my folded hands. "Image is definitely the right word," I agreed. "Because everything about you is just an image. You did not buy that car, Preston. You leased it from a luxury rental group in Buckhead on a short-term 6-month contract to impress your new clients." My father let out a nervous chuckle, trying to brush off the tension. "Well, leasing is a very smart financial move," Gerald said, attempting to sound knowledgeable. "All the wealthy businessmen lease their cars, Sydney. It is a tax write-off. Preston knows exactly what he is doing." I kept my eyes locked on Preston, watching the color slowly drain from his perfectly tanned face. "Leasing is a smart financial move if you actually make the monthly payments," I said. "But when you miss 3 consecutive payments on a heavily depreciated lease, the rental agency stops caring about your executive image." Preston slammed his hand flat on the table, his composure finally cracking. "Shut your mouth right now," he demanded, pointing a shaking finger at me. "You are completely out of line. You sit there in your cheap clothes making up ridiculous lies because you are so intimidated by my success. I own that car. I own my firm. I own everything I touch. If you own it, then why has Apex Luxury Auto Group been sending repossession notices to your office for the last week?" I asked, my voice perfectly calm and steady. "And why did they tag your license plate for immediate towing yesterday afternoon? In fact, the only reason that car is currently sitting in my father's driveway instead of your own is because you are actively hiding it from the repo man. You did not drive here to show off Preston. You drove here to stash a stolen rental vehicle in a quiet residential neighborhood where you thought they would not find it." Jasmine let out a sharp gasp, her tear-stained face turning toward her husband in shock. "Preston, what is she talking about?" Jasmine asked, her voice trembling. "You told me you bought that car in cash after your big merger last quarter. You promised me we were financially secure." Preston swallowed hard, his Adam apple bobbing visibly in his throat. He refused to look at his wife. He just kept glaring at me, his blue eyes wide with a mixture of pure panic and intense hatred. "She is lying, Jasmine," he stammered, a thick layer of sweat suddenly appearing on his forehead. "She is just an angry, bitter woman trying to ruin our Thanksgiving. It is just an administrative error with the billing department. I will have my assistant clear it up on Monday morning." "An administrative error," I repeated, letting the words hang in the air. "That is a very polite way to say you are completely broke." "I work in the financial technology industry, Preston. I know exactly how corporate credit structures work. When a hedge fund manager defaults on a basic car lease, it means his personal credit is completely tapped out. It means his business accounts are frozen. It means he does not have a single dollar of liquid capital left to his name." My mother, Brenda, stood up, gripping the edge of the table so hard her knuckles turned white. "Preston, tell me right now that she is lying," my mother pleaded, her voice cracking with desperation. "Tell me you did not bring a repossessed car to my home. The neighbors will see. The entire community will think we are criminals. We cannot have a tow truck pull up to this house on Thanksgiving Day." Preston opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. His arrogant white savior persona was rapidly melting away, leaving behind nothing but a terrified, desperate con artist who had finally been backed into a corner. He looked at my father, hoping for a lifeline, but Gerald was staring at him with a look of dawning horror. Preston tried to adjust his tie, his fingers trembling uncontrollably. "Gerald, you have to listen to me," he pleaded, his tone losing all of its previous authority. "It is just a temporary liquidity issue. The market has been incredibly volatile, and I had to perform a strategic reallocation of my personal assets to protect the primary fund." I smiled a cold, hollow smile. A strategic reallocation of personal assets does not involve hiding a vehicle behind a row of privacy hedges, I pointed out. "You are out of money, Preston. You are drowning, and you came here today looking for a life raft. You want me to sign over a 25% equity stake in a historic home to fund a man who cannot even afford a monthly car payment?" I asked, addressing my father directly. "You called him a financial genius, Dad. You said he was elevating this family. But the reality is that he is bleeding dry, and he came here today to bleed us dry too. He wants to drain the equity from this house to pay off his mounting debts before the authorities catch up with him." "That is enough," Preston yelled, his voice cracking horribly. He stood up, kicking his chair back so violently it crashed to the floor. "You do not know anything about my business. You are a nobody. You are a pathetic little girl who sits in a cubicle all day. I manage millions. I have institutional investors. I am the only reason this family has any standing left in this city. You should be down on your knees thanking me for even looking at your sister." "If you manage millions, then pay the catering bill," I said softly, gesturing toward the hallway where he had left the fake $5,000 check. "Call the restaurant right now and authorize them to cash that check. Let us see if it clears the bank or if it bounces just like your car payments." Preston stared at the hallway doorway in the distance. He did not move. He did not pick up his phone. He just stood there breathing heavily, his chest heaving under his expensive pastel shirt. The silence in the room was absolute, confirming everything I had just said. He was a complete fraud, and they all finally knew it. I leaned back in my chair, feeling a cold surge of satisfaction wash over me. The surgical precision of the truth was a beautiful thing. They had spent my entire life making me feel small and insignificant, but right now I was the only person in the room who had any real power. I watched my family stare at the man they had worshipped as a savior, realizing he was nothing more than an anchor tied to their feet, ready to drag them all down into the abyss. The silence stretched tight across the dining room until it finally snapped. Preston could not maintain the sophisticated gentleman routine for another second. The polished veneer of the wealthy hedge fund manager cracked completely wide open, revealing the ugly, arrogant core hiding underneath. He gripped the edge of the mahogany table so hard his knuckles turned stark white. "You think you are so smart, Sydney?" He hissed, his voice trembling with a dark, venomous rage that made the hair on my arms stand up. "You sit there in your cheap little outfit pretending to understand how the real world operates. You are nothing. You are a low-level data pusher who takes the public bus to work. You have absolutely no idea what it takes to survive in the elite financial circles I walk in." He stepped away from his chair, pacing the length of the room like a trapped animal. He ran a hand through his perfectly styled blonde hair, messing it up in his frantic anger. His face was flushed an angry red, and the condescending smirk he usually wore was replaced by a vicious sneer. "I came into this family, and I gave you people respectability," he continued, his voice growing louder and more unhinged with every word. "Do you have any idea what my colleagues said when I told them I was marrying a woman from Southwest Atlanta? They laughed behind my back. They told me I was marrying down. But I defended you. I defended this family. I brought Jasmine into high society, and I tried to pull all of you out of this pathetic generational mediocrity. I tried to elevate your status, and this is the thanks I get. Being interrogated and insulted by a bitter spinster who cannot even afford to pay her own rent. I watched him reveal his true colors without saying a single word. The subtle racism and blatant classism were dripping from every single syllable he spoke. He had always viewed my family as a charity case, a pet project he could use to boost his own massive ego. He genuinely thought he was the great white savior descending into the ghetto to rescue the poor black family from their own ignorance and financial illiteracy. My mother gasped, pressing her linen napkin to her mouth. "Preston, please," she begged, her voice trembling with panic. "Do not say things like that. We know how much you have done for us. We appreciate you. Sydney is just confused. She does not speak for this family. Please do not let her ruin this beautiful holiday." "Shut up, Brenda!" Preston snapped, turning his furious glare directly onto my mother. The sheer disrespect in his voice made my stomach turn, but my mother just shrank back into her chair, taking the verbal abuse exactly as I expected she would. "I am entirely done playing nice with you people. I offered you the opportunity of a lifetime to leverage this dusty old house into actual capital, and instead, you let this ignorant little girl lecture me about my own finances. You are all exactly what they say you are, small-minded and poor." Jasmine was sobbing openly now, dark mascara running down her perfectly contoured cheeks. "Preston, stop it, you are ruining everything," she cried, reaching out a shaking hand for his arm. He violently yanked his arm away from her touch, leaving her grasping at empty air. "You ruined it, Jasmine," he snarled, glaring at his own wife with pure disgust. "You and your pathetic, desperate need to show off to your little friends. You maxed out those credit cards because you are desperate to look like you belong in my world, but you do not belong. None of you do. You are just pretending." I looked at my father, expecting him to finally stand up and defend his wife and his daughter. I expected the proud patriarch of the family to throw this racist, arrogant fraud out of his house immediately. Grandfather Theodore would have dragged Preston out by his expensive collar the second he disrespected my mother. But Gerald just sat there frozen in fear. His entire sense of self-worth was so deeply tied to Preston approval that he was willing to let the man insult our entire bloodline right to our faces. "You are a coward, Dad," I said, my voice slicing clearly through the chaotic yelling and the heavy sobbing. "He is standing in grandfather house calling us small-minded and poor, and you are just going to sit there and let him do it. You are going to let him talk to your wife that way just because you think he has a checkbook." That was the breaking point for my father. But his anger was not directed at the man who had just insulted his entire existence. His anger was directed entirely at me, the person who had forced him to look in the unvarnished mirror. Gerald's face turned a dark, mottled purple. He stood up so fast his heavy wooden chair crashed backwards onto the hardwood floor with a loud bang. He slammed both of his fists down onto the dining table, making the crystal water glasses jump and clatter against the fine china plates. "Do not you dare call me a coward in my own house," Gerald roared, his voice echoing violently off the dining room walls. "You caused this, Sydney. You came in here with your jealous, bitter attitude, and you provoked him on purpose. Preston is a highly stressed man dealing with high-level corporate issues, and you pushed him over the edge with your ridiculous lies about his car and his business. He is not dealing with corporate issues, Dad," I fired back, refusing to back down an inch. "He is broke. He is a criminal. He just admitted that he thinks we are beneath him, and you are still sitting there trying to protect his feelings." "I do not care about a leased car," Gerald screamed, spit flying from his lips as he pointed a shaking finger directly at my face. "He is a man who knows how to make big moves. He is a man who understands true wealth, something you will never ever understand. You have spent your entire life being a massive disappointment to your mother and me. You sit there judging us, judging him, acting like you are so morally superior because you read a few public records on the internet." He took a heavy, threatening step toward me, his eyes wide and completely unhinged with fury. "You are a worthless parasite, Sydney. You bring absolutely nothing to this table. You have no husband, you have no house, and you cannot even afford a damn car, so shut your mouth." The hateful words ripped through the room, hanging in the suffocating air like a toxic dark cloud. "You cannot even afford a damn car, so shut your mouth." It was the ultimate insult, the final declaration of his complete lack of respect for my humanity. In his eyes, human value was solely determined by material possessions and flashy displays of wealth. Because I chose to live quietly and hide my massive wealth from their greedy hands, I was entirely worthless to him. He was willing to sacrifice his own flesh and blood to protect the fragile ego of a broke white con artist who secretly hated him. I looked at my father and felt the very last remaining thread of my familial attachment snap completely in half. There was no sadness left inside my chest. There was no grief over losing a family I never really had. There was only a cold, hard, clinical clarity. They had drawn their line in the sand. They had chosen the fake illusion over the harsh reality. They had chosen the abusive fraud over their own loyal daughter. I slowly stood up from my wooden dining chair, picking up my simple canvas tote bag from the floor. I did not cry. I did not yell back. I just looked at the three of them standing there in the complete ruins of their fake luxury Thanksgiving dinner. Jasmine weeping over her fake designer handbag, Brenda shaking in absolute fear of losing her fake country club status, Gerald panting heavily after his violent outburst, and Preston glaring at me with murderous intent. "You are absolutely right, Dad," I said, my voice eerily calm and quiet against the ringing silence of the room. "I do not have a car. But I think you will find that I do not actually need one today." Before my father could ask what I meant by that cryptic statement, the crystal chandelier above the dining table began to violently shake. It started as a low, heavy vibration deep beneath the floorboards of the historic house. The intricate crystal chandelier hanging directly above the mahogany dining table began to sway back and forth. Its delicate glass prisms clinked together in a frantic, chaotic rhythm, casting wild dancing shadows across the floral wallpaper. The water inside the expensive goblets rippled violently, spilling over the rims and soaking into the pristine white linen tablecloth. My father stopped breathing entirely. The furious red color drained from his face, leaving him looking pale and suddenly very old. He froze with his mouth half open, staring up at the ceiling in complete confusion. For a brief second, I think he genuinely believed the house was experiencing a severe earthquake. But the tremor did not come from the ground. It came from the sky. Within seconds, the low vibrations swelled into a deafening mechanical roar that seemed to press against our eardrums with an agonizing physical weight. It sounded as though a massive freight train had derailed and was currently tearing directly through the roof of the estate. The noise was absolute and all-consuming. It swallowed every other sound in the room, drowning out the frantic ticking of the grandfather clock and the heavy breathing of my panicked family members. My mother Brenda clapped both of her hands tightly over her ears and let out a high-pitched scream of pure terror, but I could not hear her voice at all. I could only see the absolute panic twisting her features as she dropped to her knees. The sheer force of the downdraft hit the back of the brick house like a Category 5 hurricane. The tall glass French doors that led out to the manicured patio began to rattle so violently against their brass hinges that I expected the glass to shatter inward at any second. The wind outside was so powerful, it forced its way through the tiny cracks in the window frames. The heavy velvet curtains were whipped wildly into the air, knocking over the tall brass candlesticks that Jasmine had so carefully arranged. Hot wax splattered across the table and onto the fake designer handbag Jasmine had dropped on the floor. A sudden violent gust ripped straight down the brick chimney of the dining room fireplace. It blew a massive cloud of dark gray soot and old ash directly across the room, covering the frozen macaroni and cheese and the dry turkey in a thick layer of filthy dust. The luxurious Thanksgiving dinner they had tried to force me to pay $5,000 for was completely destroyed in a matter of seconds. Jasmine fell to the floor, weeping hysterically, as the black soot rained down on her expensive silk jumpsuit, ruining the pristine, wealthy aesthetic she had sacrificed so much to project. I stood perfectly still next to the table, watching their fake world physically crumble around them. I did not cover my ears, and I did not run for cover. I simply turned my head and looked out through the rattling French doors. A massive dark shadow suddenly eclipsed the bright November afternoon sun, plunging the dining room into an eerie twilight. Descending slowly from the sky with a terrifying predatory grace was a sleek black twin-engine corporate helicopter. It was an absolute monster of aviation engineering. It was not a standard news chopper or a basic medical transport. It was a flying fortress designed for billionaires and elite executives. Its exterior was painted in a matte black finish that seemed to absorb the light around it, and its heavily tinted windows completely hid the occupants inside. It hovered just a few feet above the lush green grass of my grandfather-beloved backyard. The hurricane-force winds generated by the massive spinning rotor blades were completely decimating the outdoor landscape my parents cared so much about. My mother-prized rose bushes were flattened to the dirt. In an instant, their delicate red petals ripped away and scattered into the violent air. Heavy wrought iron patio chairs that weighed 50 pounds each were tossed across the lawn like cheap plastic toys, scraping against the stone pathways. The expensive outdoor heating lamps Jasmine had rented for the evening were blown violently backward, crashing into the wooden fence and shattering into hundreds of pieces. My father stumbled backward away from the glass doors, tripping over the edge of the expensive Persian rug. He fell hard onto his hands and knees, scrambling backward like a frightened child trying to escape a monster. His eyes were wide with a primal terror as he stared at the unbelievable sight unfolding in his own backyard. He had spent his entire life trying to project an image of wealth and power, but faced with the literal physical manifestation of unimaginable corporate money, he was reduced to absolute panic. Preston was standing entirely paralyzed near the head of the ruined table. His jaw was hanging wide open and his hands hung limply at his sides. He was a hedge fund manager who leased his cars and faked his lifestyle. He knew exactly what kind of unimaginable wealth it took to operate a private twin-engine helicopter. He knew that whoever was inside that machine possessed a level of financial dominance that he could not even begin to comprehend. The blood completely drained from his perfectly tanned face, leaving him looking like a terrified ghost. The arrogant smirk was gone. The white savior complex was completely shattered. He was just a broke, desperate man staring at the sky in absolute horror. The heavy metal skids of the black helicopter finally touched down onto the manicured green lawn with a heavy resounding thud that we could feel in our teeth. The engines began to power down slightly, but the massive rotor blades continued to spin, sending relentless waves of wind crashing against the back of the house. The smell of burning jet fuel seeped through the window frames, mixing with the smell of the ruined cinnamon candles and the soot-covered turkey. It was the scent of absolute, undeniable power. My family remained frozen on the floor, too terrified to move or speak. They stared at the dark tinted windows of the helicopter, waiting in sheer, agonizing suspense to see what kind of powerful entity had just landed in their backyard. They had absolutely no idea that the massive wealth they were so terrified of had been sitting quietly at the end of their dining table the entire time. The deafening roar of the helicopter blades slowly began to shift into a lower-pitched whine as the pilot reduced the engine power. The hurricane-force whines that had been battering the back of the historic brick house finally began to ease up just enough for my family to break out of their absolute paralysis. My father was the first one to move. He scrambled up from his hands and knees, his expensive suit covered in fireplace soot and dust. He stumbled toward the rattling glass patio doors, shielding his eyes from the flying debris outside. My mother Brenda and my sister Jasmine slowly crawled up from the floor, clutching each other in absolute terror. They followed my father to the French doors, peering out through the glass like frightened animals trapped in a cage. Preston remained standing near the head of the ruined dining table, his face completely pale and his entire body trembling. He looked like a man who was about to face an execution squad. He slowly turned his head to look at me, his eyes wide with a desperate, confused question he was too terrified to ask out loud. I did not run to the window, I did not shield my eyes or cower in fear. I calmly reached across the soot-covered table and picked up my crystal glass of red wine. It was the only thing on the table that had not been completely ruined by the chaos. I took a slow, deliberate sip, savoring the rich taste as I watched my family press their faces against the glass doors. I swallowed the wine and set the heavy crystal glass back down onto the mahogany table with a soft clink that somehow echoed loudly in the room. I looked directly at my frozen father, who was staring out at the massive black machine on his lawn. "My ride is here," I said, my voice perfectly clear and steady. My father snapped his head around to look at me, his jaw dropping completely open. "What are you talking about, Sydney?" he stammered, his voice barely audible over the sound of the helicopter engines. "You do not know who is in that helicopter. You are just a data pusher. Get away from the window before they see us." He genuinely thought some dangerous cartel or government agency had just raided his property. He still could not fathom the idea that his daughter, the one he had just called a worthless parasite, commanded this kind of unimaginable power. Out on the lawn, the heavy side doors of the matte black helicopter smoothly slid open. The dark tinted glass retracted, revealing the sleek, luxurious interior of the cabin. A man stepped out onto the crushed grass. He was tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a perfectly tailored charcoal gray suit and a discreet earpiece. He had the unmistakable rigid posture of high-level private security. He stepped to the side and stood at strict attention, scanning the perimeter of the backyard with cold, calculating eyes. Seconds later, two more men emerged from the cabin. They were not security. They were corporate sharks. They wore impeccable navy blue suits that cost more than my father's entire wardrobe. One of them was holding a thick black leather briefcase securely in his right hand. They moved with absolute precision and purpose, ignoring the chaos of the ruined garden around them. They did not look like men who were lost or making an emergency landing. They looked like men who were arriving to execute a highly planned hostile takeover. The three men began walking purposefully across the lawn, heading directly for the glass patio doors where my family was standing. Their polished leather shoes crunched over the shattered remains of jasmine, rented heating lamps, and my mother flattened rose bushes. They did not even glance down at the destruction. Their eyes were locked entirely on the house. My mother let out a terrified whimper and grabbed my father's arm, pulling him backward away from the glass. "Gerald, what do they want?" she cried, her voice cracking with panic. "Why are they coming to our house? Did Preston do something illegal? Is it the government?" She immediately turned her suspicion onto the white savior she had been worshipping just 10 minutes ago. Her loyalty was completely conditional, and the moment real danger arrived, she was ready to throw him to the wolves. Preston backed away from the table, his breathing becoming shallow and rapid. He bumped into the wall and just slid down until he was practically crouching on the floor. He was muttering under his breath, shaking his head back and forth in complete denial. He knew exactly what corporate lawyers looked like, and he knew they were not here to offer him a friendly venture capital deal. He was a fraud who had spent months running from his creditors, and now the ultimate collector had seemingly dropped out of the sky to collect his absolute ruin. I smoothed down the front of my simple beige sweater and walked right past my trembling parents. I reached out and grabbed the brass handle of the patio door. "What are you doing?" my father hissed, grabbing my shoulder. "Do not open that door, Sydney. Are you completely insane? They could be dangerous. Let me handle this." He was still trying to play the patriarch, still trying to maintain some illusion of control over a situation that was light years beyond his comprehension. He wanted to puff out his chest and pretend he could negotiate with the men outside. I looked down at his hand resting on my shoulder. "Remove your hand from me, Dad," I said, my tone so icy and authoritative that he physically flinched and pulled his arm back as if he had been burned. "You are not handling anything today. You just spent the last hour telling me I am a massive disappointment who cannot even afford a cheap car. So I suggest you stand back and watch how the real world operates." I turned the brass handle and pushed the heavy glass door open. The remaining wind from the helicopter blades whipped through my hair and the smell of aviation fuel hit my face. I stepped out onto the brick patio, leaving my terrified family cowering inside the ruined dining room. The men in the tailored suits stopped walking as soon as I stepped outside. The lead security guard immediately crossed his hands in front of his waist and bowed his head in a deep gesture of absolute respect. The two corporate lawyers followed suit, lowering their heads in complete deference to my presence. Through the open patio doors, I could hear my mother let out another loud gasp. They were watching the men in the million-dollar suits bow to the daughter they had just treated like a beggar. The sheer cognitive dissonance was breaking their minds. They could not process what they were seeing. Their entire worldview was being dismantled right in front of their eyes. I walked forward to meet my team, feeling the warm sun on my face. The days of hiding my wealth were officially over, and it was time to introduce my family to the empire I had built while they were busy underestimating me. I stepped off the brick patio, and my low heels sank slightly into the soft grass of the ruined lawn. The lead security guard fell into step exactly 2 paces behind my right shoulder, while the two corporate lawyers flanked my left side. It was a perfectly choreographed formation that we had practiced countless times arriving at global summits and hostile boardrooms. But executing it in the backyard of my childhood home in Cascade Heights felt infinitely more satisfying. I did not look back at the dining room, but I could hear the slow shuffling of footsteps as my family finally found the courage to creep out onto the patio behind me. The matte black helicopter sat idle on the grass, its massive engines emitting a low, powerful hum. The bright afternoon sun caught the metallic silver lettering painted sharply across the side of the aircraft. I knew exactly when Preston finally saw that logo. I heard a sharp, agonizing gasp echo from the patio, followed by the sound of someone stumbling heavily against the brick wall of the house. The silver letters spelled out, Aegis Financial. In the global financial sector, Aegis was not just a company, it was an absolute titan. It was a multi-billion-dollar conglomerate known for its aggressive market strategies and ruthless acquisitions of failing firms. For the past 6 months, Aegis had been the darkest shadow hanging over Preston and his crumbling hedge fund. We had systematically cornered his market, dismantled his investor confidence, and executed a brutal, hostile takeover that left his firm completely hollowed out. We had bought his debt for pennies on the dollar and stripped his assets down to the studs. He had spent weeks terrified of the faceless executives at Aegis who were currently liquidating his entire life work. He had begged for meetings with our board of directors, and we had ignored every single one of his desperate emails. Preston knew the Aegis logo the way a condemned man knows the face of his executioner. He had lost sleep over it. He had ruined his own marriage trying to outrun it. And now that very same logo was parked on the lawn of the family he so deeply despised. I turned around slowly to face them. My father was staring at the helicopter, his mouth hanging open in complete awe. My mother and Jasmine were clinging to each other, their eyes wide with confusion. But Preston was a completely different story. He was leaning heavily against the brick wall, clutching his chest as if he were having a massive heart attack. His perfectly styled blonde hair was disheveled, and his expensive pastel shirt was drenched in cold sweat. He was staring back and forth between the silver Aegis logo and my calm beige sweater, unable to bridge the massive gap in his reality. "Sydney, what is going on?" my father demanded, his voice shaking with a mixture of fear and forced authority. "Who are these men on my property? Why is there a corporate helicopter sitting on my grass?" He was still trying to act like the patriarch, but his voice cracked horribly on the last word. I ignored my father completely and kept my eyes locked on my brother-in-law. Preston seemed to be shrinking under my gaze, his tall frame curling inward as the horrifying truth began to dawn on him. He remembered every single insult he had hurled at me over the Thanksgiving turkey. He remembered calling me a data pusher and a nobody. He remembered telling me I was too poor to understand high-level finance. He had offered me $500 in pocket money while I was the one holding the keys to his entire existence. "You look a little pale." "Preston," I said, my voice ringing clearly across the patio. "You were just talking so confidently about venture capital and strategic acquisitions. I thought you would be thrilled to see the very people who just acquired your entire portfolio." Preston opened his mouth, but the only sound that came out was a pathetic dry wheeze. His knees buckled slightly, and he had to slide his hands down the brick wall just to keep himself standing upright. Jasmine looked at her husband, and then at me, her face twisting with fresh panic. "Preston, what is she talking about?" Jasmine cried, shaking his arm. "Who are these people, Sydney? Why are they acting like they work for you?" She looked at the expensive suits of my legal team and the sheer power radiating from the security detail, and her brain simply could not process the hierarchy. I gestured to the senior lawyer standing to my left. His name was Marcus, and he charged $2,000 an hour to dismantle arrogant men just like Preston. Marcus opened his thick black leather briefcase and pulled out a pristine stack of legal documents. He did not hand them to Preston. He simply held them at his side, waiting for my direct command. "Allow me to formally introduce myself to the family," I said, folding my hands neatly in front of me. "You have spent the last 32 years treating me like a pathetic burden because I refused to play your shallow games of fake luxury. You worshipped Preston because he leased a Porsche and wore expensive suits. You allowed him to disrespect our bloodline and insult our heritage because you thought his whiteness and his fake hedge fund made him a savior. But while you were busy maximizing your credit cards to look rich, I was busy building an actual empire in absolute silence." I took a step closer to the patio, my eyes boring directly into Preston's terrified blue eyes. "I am the founder and chief executive officer of Aegis Financial." I stated the words, landing like heavy stones in the quiet afternoon air. "I own the conglomerate that just hostile took over your failing hedge fund, Preston. I am the faceless executive you have been begging for a meeting with. I am the person who froze your corporate accounts, and I am the person who authorized the repossession of your rental car." My mother let out a loud, piercing shriek and covered her mouth with both hands. She looked at me as if I had just transformed into an alien creature right in front of her. My father stumbled backward, almost tripping over a broken patio chair. He was shaking his head violently, completely unable to process the fact that the daughter he had just told to shut up was actually a billionaire titan of industry. The man he had worshipped was a peasant compared to the daughter he had thrown away. But Preston's reaction was the most satisfying of all. The white savior facade completely shattered into a million irreparable pieces. His eyes rolled back slightly, and his legs finally gave out completely. He collapsed onto the brick patio, landing hard on his knees right at my feet. He did not try to get up. He just kneeled there in his ruined designer clothes, staring up at me with absolute sheer terror. He was completely paralyzed by the catastrophic magnitude of his own massive mistake. He had spent the entire afternoon bragging about his financial genius to the exact woman who owned every single dollar he had ever touched. The silence that followed was absolute perfection. There was no more yelling, and there were no more arrogant threats. There was only the low hum of my helicopter engines and the pathetic sound of Preston gasping for air on the ground. I had stripped away his fake wealth, his fake power, and his fake superiority in one single devastating blow. But I was not finished yet, because taking his company was just business. What came next was personal, and it was going to destroy him completely. Marcus stepped forward and handed me the heavy black leather briefcase. I placed it gently on the small wrought iron table that had survived the wind from the helicopter blades. I snapped the brass latches open and pulled out a thick stack of papers, bound tightly in a red legal folder. The bright red cover was the standard color our firm used for critical forensic audits. I looked down at Preston, who was still kneeling on the cold brick patio. He was staring at the red folder as if it were a loaded weapon pointed directly at his chest. "You see, Preston, when Aegis acquired your firm, we did not just buy your assets," I explained, my voice steady and completely devoid of any sympathy. "We bought your massive liabilities and your entire accounting history. And because I take my corporate acquisitions very seriously, I ordered my team to conduct a complete and thorough forensic audit of every single transaction you authorized over the last 4 years. I wanted to know exactly how a hedge fund with such a promising start managed to completely implode so quickly and leave so many investors completely ruined. I flipped open the heavy red cover and looked at the first page of the detailed executive summary. It took my dedicated team of forensic accountants less than 48 hours to find the massive gaping hole in your books. You were not a victim of a volatile market like you confidently told my father at the dinner table. You were not making strategic reallocations of personal assets to protect your primary fund. You were stealing. My father let out a choked sound, stepping away from Preston as if the man were suddenly a contagious disease. Stealing, my father repeated the word, hanging heavily and awkwardly in the air. Yes, Dad, stealing, I said, turning the crisp page of the audit file. Specifically embezzling exactly $2 million directly from the retirement accounts of your oldest and most vulnerable clients. He set up a complex series of fake shell companies and slowly siphoned the money out over the course of 18 long months. He used those stolen client funds to pay for the leased Porsche sitting in the driveway, the fake designer bags for Jasmine, the expensive country club memberships, and the imported French wine he bragged about buying for Thanksgiving dinner. He funded his entire fake wealthy lifestyle with money he stole from innocent, hard-working people who trusted him with their life savings. Jasmine let out a horrible, gut-wrenching sob that echoed across the ruined lawn. She dropped to her knees right next to her husband and began hitting his shoulder weakly with her fists. "Tell me she is lying, Preston," she screamed, her voice cracking with pure hysteria and absolute devastation. "Tell me you did not steal that money. Tell me I am not married to a common criminal." Preston did not even try to defend himself against her blows. He just curled his body inward, trying to shield himself from his wife and from the crushing, undeniable weight of his exposed crimes. He knew the financial evidence in that red folder was absolutely bulletproof. He knew his career was completely over. "This is exactly why you were so desperate to get my parents to sign that quitclaim deed today." I continued, slamming the heavy folder shut with a loud, sharp crack. "You knew the quarterly financial reports were due on Monday morning. You knew the missing $2 million was about to be discovered by the federal regulatory agencies. You needed a massive influx of cash immediately to cover your sloppy tracks and avoid federal prison. So you came here to manipulate my foolish parents into mortgaging the only real asset they had left. You were perfectly willing to leave them completely homeless and drowning in impossible debt just to save your own pathetic skin for a few more months." My mother collapsed backward against the brick wall, sliding down until she was sitting on the dirty patio floor. She was staring at Preston with a look of absolute sheer horror and disbelief. The sophisticated man she had worshipped, the man she had allowed to insult her own daughter in her own home, was a ruthless thief who had actively planned to steal her house. The perfect high society image she cared so much about was completely, permanently destroyed. "You are a complete monster," my father whispered, staring down at the pathetic man kneeling on his patio. "I trusted you with everything. I defended you against my own flesh and blood. I almost gave you the deed to my father's historic house. You almost gave him my house, Dad." I corrected him sharply, refusing to let him rewrite the narrative. "Because remember, you do not own this property anymore. If I had not quietly bought this house out of foreclosure 2 years ago, you would have handed it directly to a desperate felon today. You were so blinded by his skin color and his fake expensive suits that you ignored every single glaring red flag. You chose his comfortable lies over my harsh truth." Preston finally found his voice. It was a weak, trembling, pathetic whimper. "Sydney, please," he begged, looking up at me with thick tears streaming down his red face. "You have all the power now. You can bury this audit in your corporate files. You can make it disappear entirely. I will do absolutely anything you want me to do. I will divorce Jasmine right now. I will sign whatever legal documents you want me to sign. Just please do not turn that folder over to the authorities. I cannot go to a federal prison. I will not survive in a place like that. I looked down at the pathetic man who had tormented me and my family for years with his arrogant white savior complex. He was perfectly willing to throw his wife away in a single heartbeat just to save himself. He had absolutely no loyalty and no moral compass. He was completely hollow inside. I smiled a cold, empty smile down at him. I am afraid you are a little too late for closed-door negotiations, Preston, I said softly. Right at that exact moment, a faint, high-pitched sound began to drift through the crisp November air. It started as a low, distant wail echoing from the main highway several miles away. But it was growing steadily louder and significantly more distinct with every passing second. The rhythmic rising and falling pitch of multiple police sirens cut violently through the quiet, peaceful atmosphere of the upscale Cascade Heights neighborhood. Preston head whipped toward the terrifying sound, his blue eyes wide with absolute sheer panic. "No," he gasped, scrambling backward on his hands and knees like a frightened animal. "No, you did not do this. You could not have done this. I did not just freeze your bank accounts, Preston," I said, my voice ringing clearly over the rapidly approaching sirens. "I am the chief executive officer of a highly regulated global financial institution. When my internal auditors uncover $2 million in federal wire fraud, I am legally obligated to report it immediately." I forwarded the entire contents of this red folder to the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the local Atlanta authorities 2 hours before I even arrived for dinner today. The sound of the heavy sirens was absolutely deafening now, pouring into the quiet neighborhood from multiple directions. The flashing red and blue emergency lights began to reflect off the tall windows of the surrounding historic mansions. The grand illusion was officially over. The great white savior was about to be dragged out of my backyard in cold steel handcuffs, and my family was finally going to watch their entire fake world burn to the ground. Preston scrambled forward on his knees, his hands reaching out to grab the hem of my beige sweater. The man who had spent the last decade making me feel entirely invisible was now weeping at my feet like a terrified child. "Sydney, you have to stop them," he pleaded, his voice thick with snot and desperate tears. "You have to call the FBI right now and tell them it was all a massive misunderstanding. Tell them we are handling the audit internally. I will give you whatever you want. I will sign the hedge fund over to you completely free of charge. Just please do not let them put me in handcuffs. I am a respectable man. I cannot go to jail." I stepped back out of his reach, looking down at his pathetic, trembling hands. "You are not a respectable man, Preston," I said, my voice devoid of any warmth. "You are a thief who targets the elderly, and your hedge fund is already mine. I do not need you to sign anything over to me because my legal team has already seized every single asset you possess. The police are not coming to negotiate, they are coming to arrest you." Jasmine, who had been kneeling next to him in a state of absolute shock, suddenly snapped out of her paralysis. The survival instinct of a true narcissist kicked in with terrifying speed. She violently shoved Preston away from her, causing him to fall sideways onto the brick patio. She scrambled to her feet, her mascara-stained face twisting into a mask of pure, innocent betrayal. She looked at me with wide, terrified eyes, immediately throwing her husband straight under the approaching police cruisers. "I did not know," Sydney, Jasmine screamed, her voice shrill and desperate. "I swear to God, I had absolutely no idea he was doing any of this. He told me the firm was thriving. He lied to me just like he lied to Dad. You cannot let them think I was involved in this. I am a victim here. He completely manipulated me. He is a monster." She pointed a shaking finger at the man she had just claimed was her provider and protector. "You ruined my life," she yelled at Preston, kicking him hard in the shoulder. "You bought me fake bags and you dragged me into a massive federal crime. I am divorcing you the minute they take you away. I will not let you drag my reputation down into the mud with you." Preston stared up at his wife, his jaw dropping open in complete disbelief. "Jasmine, you knew the accounts were frozen," he gasped, clutching his shoulder where she had kicked him. "You knew we were drowning in debt. You begged me to get the money from your parents so you would not lose your country club membership. Do not stand there and act like you are innocent." "I am innocent!" Jasmine shrieked dramatically, pressing the back of her hand to her forehead. "I am just a naive wife who trusted her husband too much. Sydney, you have to believe me. You are my sister. You have to protect me from him." I watched her perform her little one-act play, feeling a deep sense of disgust settling in my stomach. She was perfectly willing to sit at the dinner table and help him steal our parents' house, but the second the consequences arrived, she morphed into a helpless damsel in distress. She had absolutely zero loyalty to anyone but herself. Before I could even respond to Jasmine's pathetic performance, my mother Brenda suddenly pushed her way past her. She rushed toward me, holding her arms out wide as if she were about to wrap me in a massive, loving embrace. The transformation on her face gave me genuine whiplash. The angry, bitter woman who had just called me a selfish parasite was entirely gone. In her place was a beaming, proud mother, looking at me with eyes full of absolute adoration and worship. "Oh, my beautiful, brilliant daughter," my mother cried, stopping just inches away from me. "I knew it. I always knew you were destined for absolute greatness, Sydney. I always told the ladies at church that my youngest daughter was working on something massive in secret. You are a billionaire. My own flesh and blood is the chief executive officer of a global conglomerate. I am just so incredibly proud of you, I could burst." She reached out to touch my arm, but I smoothly stepped backward, crossing my arms over my chest. She let her hands drop, but her manic smile did not falter for a single second. "You did not know anything, Mom," I said, my voice flat and cold. "10 minutes ago, you told me I was dead weight. You told me God was watching me and judging me for being poor. You literally told me to shut my mouth because I could not afford a car." My father, Gerald, suddenly stepped up beside my mother, clearing his throat nervously. He smoothed down his soot-covered suit vest and offered me a wide, forced smile that did not reach his panicked eyes. "Now, Sydney, let us not get bogged down in the heat of the moment," my father said, his tone entirely different from the aggressive roar he had used earlier. "We were just stressed. We were worried about the family finances. We did not know you had already solved all of our problems. You have to understand, we were just trying to push you to reach your true potential. It was tough love, that is all. Tough love," I repeated, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. "You threw a heavy silver serving spoon at my head and threatened to have me escorted off the property for trespassing. That is not tough love, Dad. That is just abuse." "No, no, you misunderstand," Gerald insisted, waving his hands frantically as if he could magically erase the last 2 hours. "We are family, Sydney. We have always loved you. We were just blinded by Preston's terrible lies. He manipulated us. He preyed on our desire to build a legacy. But now that we know the truth, now that we see who the real financial genius in this family is, everything is going to change. We are so incredibly proud to call you our daughter. You are the true pride of the Williams family." The sheer audacity of their rapid pivot was almost impressive. They had spent 32 years treating me like a complete outcast, forcing me to shrink myself down to make their golden child feel better. But the exact second they realized I possessed the one thing they worshipped above all else, money, they immediately changed course, like vultures flocking to a fresh carcass. They did not care about the emotional abuse they had inflicted on me. They did not feel any genuine remorse for their actions. They only cared about how my massive bank account could benefit them. The sound of the sirens was deafening now. Red and blue emergency lights flashed brilliantly through the tall oak trees lining the street. The heavy tires of several police cruisers screeched to a sudden halt directly in front of the historic brick house. Doors slammed open, and the heavy boots of federal agents and local officers began marching rapidly up the front driveway. Preston let out a final pathetic sob, pressing his face onto the cold brick patio. He knew there was absolutely no escape. Jasmine took 2 large steps away from him, desperately trying to distance herself from the criminal she had married. My parents ignored the police completely, their greedy eyes locked entirely on me. They thought the danger had passed. They thought that because I was rich, I was automatically going to step into the role of the new family savior. They had absolutely no idea that I was about to drop the final devastating hammer on their pathetic parasitic existence. Two federal agents in dark windbreakers rounded the corner of the brick house, followed closely by four local police officers. They stepped onto the ruined patio with their hands resting on their utility belts. The lead agent did not even ask for identification. He walked straight toward Preston, who was still curled on the ground, and hauled him up by the collar of his ruined pastel shirt. Preston did not fight back. He just wept loudly as the cold steel handcuffs clicked tightly around his wrists. The agent read him his rights in a flat mechanical voice, while the local officers began securing the area. Jasmine tried to approach the agents weeping and claiming she was a victim of financial abuse, but a female officer firmly guided her back toward the wall. They dragged the great white savior across the ruined grass and shoved him into the back of a police cruiser parked in the driveway. My parents did not watch him go. They did not care that their golden child was legally bound to a federal criminal. As soon as the police officers disappeared around the side of the house, my father turned his attention entirely back to me. His eyes were wide with a frantic, greedy energy. "Well, that was certainly an ugly piece of business," Gerald said, brushing some soot off his sleeve as if he were just clearing away a minor inconvenience. "But honestly, Sydney, this might be the absolute best thing that could have happened to us today. The Lord works in mysterious ways, and He has clearly removed a toxic element from our lives to make room for a true blessing." I stared at him, letting his insane rationalization hang in the air. "A true blessing?" I asked, my voice dangerously quiet. "Yes," my mother chimed in, stepping forward to stand shoulder to shoulder with my father. "We do not need a man like Preston dragging our family name through the mud. We have you, Sydney. We have a real billionaire in the family. We do not have to pretend anymore because you can finally give us the life we actually deserve." My father nodded enthusiastically, his forced smile stretching so wide it looked painful. "Exactly, Sydney," he said, taking another step toward me. "Now that Preston is out of the picture, we have a bit of a mess to clean up. But it is nothing a person with your massive resources cannot handle. First, we need you to call your corporate public relations team. We need a press release immediately stating that the Williams family had absolutely no knowledge of his crimes. We need to protect our reputation at the country club before the evening news gets a hold of this story." He paused for a second, licking his dry lips before delivering the most audacious demand of my entire life. "And then we need to talk about this house," he said, gesturing to the historic brick walls behind him. "Obviously, we cannot go through with the venture capital loan now, but we are still behind on the mortgage payments. We need you to write a check to clear the remaining balance on the house. It is only about $400,000. For a chief executive officer of your caliber, that is basically pocket change." I looked back and forth between the two of them. They were completely serious. Their son-in-law had just been arrested for stealing millions of dollars, and their very first instinct was to ask me to pay their bills. They genuinely believed that my money was their money simply because we shared the same last name. "You want me to pay off your mortgage," I stated flatly, making sure I heard him correctly. "It is the right thing to do." My father insisted, his tone shifting back to that familiar demanding authority he had always used with me. "Grandfather, Theodore left you a 25% stake in this property. That means you have a legal and moral obligation to maintain it. You have been hoarding your massive wealth in secret while your mother and I have been struggling to keep a roof over our heads. It is incredibly selfish of you to sit on billions of dollars while your own family faces financial ruin." My mother nodded her head in vigorous agreement. "We sacrificed everything to raise you, Sydney," she added, her voice taking on a whining, manipulative edge. "We paid for your clothes and your food and your education. You owe us this. And quite frankly, it is the least you can do after embarrassing your sister by exposing her credit card debt in front of everyone. You need to pay off Jasmine debt too, so she can start completely fresh after her divorce." Jasmine sniffled loudly from the corner of the patio, dabbing at her ruined makeup. She nodded in agreement with my mother, stepping away from the brick wall to join them. It is the absolute least you can do. Sydney, Jasmine whined, her voice thick with pure entitlement. I am a victim of severe financial trauma now. I cannot be expected to live in my current apartment with all the terrible memories of Preston. I need you to buy me a luxury condo in Buckhead and completely furnish it. And I am going to need a new car since the Porsche is being repossessed. Just a small Range Rover will be fine. The sheer, blinding audacity of their demands was almost magnificent to witness. They were standing in a backyard, destroyed by my private helicopter, demanding that I use my corporate empire to fund their fake luxury lifestyle. They wanted me to clean up Preston Federal scandal, pay off Jasmine careless shopping sprees, buy her a luxury vehicle, and clear the mortgage on a house they had repeatedly threatened to kick me out of. They wanted to install me as the new family bank to replace the broken one that had just been hauled away in a police cruiser. They did not feel an ounce of shame or remorse for the horrific way they had treated me just moments prior. I looked at the lead lawyer Marcus, who was standing quietly to my left. He raised a single eyebrow in silent disbelief at the sheer delusion radiating from my family. Even a seasoned corporate shark like him had never seen this level of shameless, unchecked greed. I turned my attention back to my father, who was already pulling a silver pen out of his pocket, anticipating that I would simply write him a blank check right there on the soot-covered patio. You want me to use my money to save your reputation at the country club? I said, my voice dropping an octave. You want me to pay off a mortgage that you took out behind my back to cover Jasmine's previous failures? We are family, Gerald repeated sternly, as if that single word was a magic spell that erased 32 years of emotional abuse. Your money belongs to this family. You are going to do your duty and protect our legacy. I let out a slow, cold breath. The absolute final shred of mercy I had left for these people evaporated into the crisp November air. They did not want a daughter. They wanted a wealthy host they could latch onto and drain dry. It was time to show them exactly what happened when you tried to extort the person holding all the cards. I turned away from my parents and walked slowly back through the shattered glass patio doors into the ruined dining room. The soot-covered turkey and the spilled red wine painted a pathetic picture of their fake holiday. My father and mother followed me inside, their eyes tracking my every movement like starving dogs watching a piece of meat. Jasmine trailed behind them, still sniffling and muttering about her ruined luxury lifestyle. I reached across the mahogany table and picked up the thick stack of legal papers Preston had so arrogantly slid toward me just an hour ago. The bold black letters spelling out quitclaim deeds stared back at me. I looked at the document and then I looked at my family. And for the first time that entire afternoon, I laughed. It was not a warm or joyful sound. It was a chilling, bitter laugh that echoed harshly off the vintage floral wallpaper. The sound of it made my mother physically flinch and take a step backward. "What is so funny, Sydney?" my father asked, his forced smile faltering into a look of genuine confusion. "This is serious business. We need to get these financial matters settled immediately so we can move forward as a united family. You need to sign that paper so we can start the process of clearing our debts and saving our reputation." I held the quitclaim deed up in the air so they could all clearly see the predatory legal jargon. Then I placed my hands on the top edge of the thick paper and violently ripped it entirely in half. The sharp, tearing sound sliced through the quiet room. I ripped the pages again and dropped the torn pieces onto the soot-covered floor right next to Jasmine's fake designer bag. "Are you completely out of your mind?" Gerald yelled, his face instantly turning a dark shade of red. He stepped forward, pointing a shaking finger at the torn papers on the floor. That was a legally binding document drawn up by expensive attorneys. We needed that to secure the equity on this house. You just destroyed our only way to leverage this property and get the cash we desperately need. I shook my head slowly, resting my hands flat against the ruined mahogany table. "You cannot leverage a property that you do not even own, Dad," I said, my voice dropping to a low, steady whisper that carried heavily across the room. The anger on my father's face instantly vanished, replaced by a look of sheer, terrifying panic. He froze completely, his hands still hovering in the air. My mother let out a small, choked gasp and grabbed his arm as if her legs were about to give out. "What are you talking about?" Brenda stammered, her eyes darting nervously around the room. "Of course we own this house. Your grandfather Theodore left it to us. It has been in the Williams family for over 40 years. We have the original deed in the safe upstairs. You have a worthless piece of paper in the safe," I corrected her smoothly. "But you do not have the title to this estate anymore. I know exactly what you and Dad did 2 years ago. I know that you secretly went behind my back and took out a massive second mortgage on this historic property. And I know you did not use that money to fix the roof or update the plumbing. You took out that loan to bail Jasmine out of her massive failed online boutique business." Jasmine face drained of all color. She took a huge step backward, bumping hard into the hallway doorframe. She had spent the last 2 years pretending her boutique had simply been acquired by a larger firm to save face with her shallow social media friends. She never thought I would uncover the massive financial crater she had left behind. "You were completely desperate to protect your golden child from the embarrassment of public bankruptcy." I continued, relentlessly staring directly into my father-terrified eyes. "So you leveraged grandfather legacy. You risked the only true asset this family had ever built. But Jasmine could not pay you back because she immediately started maxing out new credit cards to buy fake luxury goods to keep up her wealthy image. And because neither of you had the actual income to cover a massive second mortgage, you started missing payments. 1 month turned into 3. 3 months turned into 6. My father opened his mouth to deny it, but the heavy truth was suffocating him. He looked like a man who was drowning in plain sight. "The bank foreclosed on this house exactly 24 months ago," I stated, the undeniable facts slicing through their pathetic web of lies. "They sent you dozens of notices. They called you relentlessly. But you ignored them because you were too proud to admit you had completely failed. You thought you could somehow trick Preston into using his fake venture capital fund to pay off the bank before the final eviction notice arrived. You thought you could force me to sign away my 25% equity to make your fraudulent scheme look legitimate to the lenders. You wanted me to sign a worthless piece of paper to cover up the fact that you had already lost our family home." The silence in the ruined dining room was absolute and devastating. The grand illusion of the wealthy Williams family was completely shattered, lying in pieces on the floor right next to the torn quitclaim deed. My parents had spent my entire life looking down on me from their imaginary pedestal, and now they were standing in the wreckage of their own massive financial incompetence. My mother began to weep loudly, clutching her hands to her chest. "Oh God," she wailed, her voice thick with genuine despair, "it is all gone. We have absolutely nothing left." "Where are we going to go, Gerald? The bank is going to send the sheriff to throw our things out onto the street. The entire neighborhood will see us. We will be completely ruined." Gerald suddenly snapped his head up, his eyes locking onto me with a fresh surge of desperate, greedy hope. "Wait!" he gasped, stepping toward the table and holding his hands out toward me. "Wait, Sydney, you can fix this. You just said you are the chief executive officer of a billion-dollar company. You have more money than we could ever imagine. You can just call the bank right now. You can buy the house back for us. You can pay the bank whatever they want and keep this property in the family. We can just start over." I looked at him and let out another cold, hollow laugh. "The bank does not own this house, Dad," I said softly. My father blinked, his forehead wrinkling in total confusion. "But you just said they foreclosed on it," he argued, his voice trembling with desperation. "You said we lost it to the bank." "You did lose it to the bank," I clarified, stepping around the dining table so there was nothing standing between us. "And then the bank put it up for public auction exactly 24 months ago to recoup their financial losses. It was a very quiet corporate auction. The kind of auction that is only accessible to high-net-worth individuals and institutional investors. The bank wanted their money immediately in cash." I watched the realization slowly begin to dawn behind his eyes, but his brain simply refused to connect the final terrifying dots. He could not comprehend a reality where he was not in control. When this house went onto the auction block, I did not let a stranger buy it. I continued, my voice ringing with absolute authority. I instructed my corporate attorneys to form a blind limited liability company specifically for the purpose of acquiring this property. I wired the funds directly from my private accounts. I bought this entire estate in cash paid in full 24 months ago. The air completely left the room. My mother stopped crying mid-sob. Jasmine's jaw dropped so far open she looked completely absurd. I am the sole legal owner of this historic property, I stated, driving the final nail into the coffin of their arrogance. My name is the only name on the deed. I pay the property taxes. I pay the insurance. For the last 2 years, you have been waking up in my bedrooms, cooking in my kitchen, and hosting your fake luxury parties in my backyard. The family that just sat at this table and called me a worthless parasite has been living completely rent-free in my house. You could hear a pin drop in the dining room. The power dynamic did not just shift, it completely inverted and crushed them under its massive weight. The very foundation they were standing on literally belonged to the daughter they had spent decades abusing. You called me dead weight, Mom, I said, turning my cold gaze toward Brenda. You told me I was holding this family back. But the absolute truth is that I am the only reason you have not been sleeping in a cheap motel for the last 2 years. I protected grandfather's legacy while you actively tried to destroy it. My mother let out a small, pathetic whimper. Sydney, please, she begged, reaching her trembling hands out toward me. We did not know. We had no idea you were the one who saved us. Oh, my sweet girl, you kept a roof over our heads. You are our guardian angel. This is a true blessing from God. We can just stay here and be a family again. You can take care of us properly now. She was still doing it. She was still trying to spin the narrative to benefit her own selfish desires. She thought my ownership of the house meant they were permanently safe. She thought the abuse of the past could simply be swept under the rug because we shared a bloodline. I stepped back completely out of her reach, looking at the three of them with pure, unapologetic disgust. I did not save this house for you, I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous, icy tone. I saved this house for Grandfather Theodore. I bought it to protect the only piece of this family that ever actually loved me. And I let you stay here because I wanted to see exactly how far your greed and your arrogance would push you before you finally exposed your true colors. I gestured toward the open patio doors, where the sound of my helicopter engines was still humming steadily. You showed me exactly who you are today, I continued. You showed me that you will always choose money over loyalty and fake status over your own flesh and blood. You are not a family. You are just parasites. The blue and red lights from the police cruisers painted the ruined dining room walls in harsh alternating colors. I watched through the shattered French doors as the federal agents finally shoved Preston into the back of their heavily armored vehicle. He hit his head hard on the metal doorframe, but they did not care. The heavy door slammed shut, instantly cutting off the sound of his pathetic sobbing. Jasmine watched her husband get driven away without shedding a single genuine tear for him. Her eyes were already darting frantically around the patio, clearly calculating her next move, now that her primary source of funding was heading straight to a federal prison cell. My father stood frozen in the center of the dining room, his shoulders completely slumped in absolute defeat. He looked down at the torn pieces of the quitclaim deed scattered across the soot-covered floor, and then slowly looked up at me. Sydney, please be reasonable, Gerald said, his voice completely devoid of its former booming authority. We are your parents. You cannot just throw us out onto the street. We have nowhere to go. My credit is completely ruined, and your mother has not worked a job in 30 years. We will be absolutely destitute. I turned away from his pleading face and looked at the lead security guard who was standing silently by the open patio door. I gave him a slight, deliberate nod. He stepped fully into the dining room, his massive frame imposing and undeniable. He raised his hand and signaled to the other armed guards, who immediately fanned out across the first floor of the house, blocking the exits and securing the hallways. You have exactly 2 hours to pack your personal belongings and vacate my property, I said, my voice echoing coldly off the high ceilings. If you are not completely off these premises by the time that grandfather clock strikes 6, my security team will physically remove you." My mother let out a blood-curdling shriek that sounded like a wounded animal. She threw herself onto the hardwood floor, reaching out and grabbing aggressively at the ankles of my simple dark jeans. "You cannot do this," she wailed, tears streaming down her face and completely ruining her expensive makeup. "We are your flesh and blood, Sydney. God commands you to honor your mother and father. You must show us mercy. Jesus teaches endless forgiveness. You cannot let your own family become homeless vagrants." I looked down at her grasping hands and took a deliberate step backward, forcing her to let go of me. "Do not weaponize your religion against me, Mom," I said, staring down at her pathetic display. "You did not care about mercy when you watched Jasmine shove that $5,000 catering bill into my chest. You did not care about forgiveness when you told me I was a selfish parasite holding this family back. You only care about the Bible when you can use it as a convenient shield to protect yourself from the harsh consequences of your own terrible actions." Jasmine pushed past my father, her face red and blotchy with anger and panic. "What about me?" she demanded, her voice shrill and demanding. "I am getting a divorce. I am a victim of severe financial abuse. You have billions of dollars, Sydney. You can easily afford to put me up in a luxury hotel in Buckhead until I figure things out. You owe me that much as my sister." "I do not owe you a single breath of air, Jasmine," I replied, staring her down until she physically shrank back from the intensity in my eyes. "You sat at this table and actively tried to help Preston steal the last of Dad equity. You knew exactly what you were doing. The only thing I am giving you today is a reality check. You have exactly 120 minutes to pack your fake designer bags and get out of my sight." My father tried to step forward, his hands raised in a desperate, pleading gesture. "Sydney, just give us a month," he begged, his eyes wide with sheer blinding terror. "Just 30 days to figure out a cheap apartment, to get our things into a storage unit. We cannot possibly pack an entire 4-bedroom house in 2 hours." "You are not packing the house," I corrected him sharply, stopping him dead in his tracks. "You are packing your clothes, your basic toiletries, and your personal electronics. The antique furniture, the expensive artwork, and the silver crystal all stay right where they are. They belong to the estate, my estate. My security team will escort you to your bedrooms, and they will monitor every single item you put into your bags. If you attempt to steal anything that belongs to this property, you will be arrested for theft, just like your brilliant son-in-law." The absolute finality of my words hit them like a physical blow to the chest. The absolute power I wielded in that moment was completely unshakable. They realized right then that all their emotional manipulation, all their religious guilt-tripping, and all their angry screaming meant absolutely nothing anymore. I was a fortress of solid ice, and they were completely out of matches. The lead security guard stepped forward, placing a heavy, unyielding hand on my father's shoulder. "Time is ticking, sir," the guard said, his voice deep and menacing. "I highly suggest you start moving toward the stairs right now." The next 2 hours were a pathetic symphony of pure chaos and ultimate humiliation. I sat quietly in the formal living room, sipping a fresh glass of cold water, while my security team systematically dismantled my family fake wealthy lives. I listened to the frantic sound of wooden drawers being violently pulled open and suitcases being zipped shut. I heard my mother weeping uncontrollably in the upstairs master bedroom, mourning the permanent loss of her massive walk-in closet. I heard Jasmine screaming hysterically at a security guard in the hallway because he refused to let her pack a vintage silver tea set that belonged to my grandfather. They were being stripped of their unearned luxury, down to the absolute bare bones of reality. When the antique grandfather clock in the hallway finally chimed 6 heavy times, the massive front door swung open. I walked out onto the front porch and stood at the top of the wide brick steps. The crisp evening air had completely settled over the Cascade Heights neighborhood, and the vintage streetlights were just beginning to flicker on, casting long shadows across the manicured lawns. My family stumbled out the front door carrying heavy black plastic garbage bags filled with their clothes. Jasmine had completely run out of her cheap designer luggage and was forced to stuff her shoes and dresses into heavy-duty outdoor trash bags. My father was sweating profusely, struggling to carry two massive heavy suitcases down the brick steps. My mother walked slowly behind them, her head bowed entirely in shame, holding a single small overnight bag. They looked exactly like what they truly were, a group of desperate broke people who had finally been evicted from a wealthy fantasy they could not afford. They dragged their heavy garbage bags down the long paved driveway, stopping at the edge of the public street. They had absolutely no cars. Jasmine leased Porsche had already been loaded onto a flatbed tow truck by the repossession company an hour ago, and my parents had secretly sold their own vehicle months ago to keep up appearances. They were standing on the cold curb of the wealthy neighborhood they cared so much about, waiting for a cheap rideshare to take them to a discount roadside motel. I walked around the side of the historic brick house, heading toward the expansive backyard, where my private helicopter was still waiting for me. The massive rotor blades began to slowly rotate as the pilot prepared for our immediate departure. I stepped onto the soft green grass, leaving the ruined brick patio and the shattered dining room entirely behind me. Marcus, the lead attorney, walked up to me and handed me the signed eviction confirmation paperwork. "Everything is completely secure, Mrs. Williams," he said, his tone highly respectful. "The exterior locks are already being changed, and a full private security detail will remain on the property 24 hours a day to ensure they do not attempt to return." "Thank you, Marcus," I said, taking the heavy legal paperwork and sliding it into my canvas tote bag. I climbed into the luxurious leather cabin of the matte black helicopter and strapped myself securely into the comfortable seat. The heavy doors slid shut, sealing me in absolute quiet isolation away from the chaos of the world outside. As the powerful twin engines roared to life, the aircraft lifted smoothly off the ground, ascending rapidly into the darkening November sky. I looked out the tinted glass window, down at the historic Cascade Heights neighborhood. I could clearly see the tiny figures of my parents and my sister standing on the street corner, completely surrounded by shiny black garbage bags. For my entire life, I had been repeatedly told that family was everything. I had been heavily indoctrinated to believe that generational wealth meant holding on to the exact same brick house and the exact same toxic bloodlines, no matter how much emotional abuse they inflicted on you. But looking down at them from 1,000 feet in the air, I finally understood the absolute truth. True generational wealth is not about hoarding money or protecting expensive real estate. It is about the absolute freedom to walk away from people who fundamentally do not value your humanity. It is about protecting your mental peace of mind and permanently preserving your self-respect. I had officially broken the dark cycle of financial abuse and toxic emotional manipulation. I was leaving the heavy, suffocating chains of their expectations completely behind me forever. The helicopter banked sharply, turning toward the glowing modern skyline of downtown Atlanta. The bright neon lights of the city spread out before me like a massive, glittering ocean of endless possibility. I did not feel any sadness. I did not feel any regret. I felt incredibly light. I felt undeniably powerful. I felt completely and absolutely free. The no-contact resolution was absolute and permanent. They would never see my face or hear my voice again. My name is Sydney and I am 32 years old. I survived the toxic expectations of my abusive family, and I built a massive corporate empire in the ashes of their constant underestimation. Have you ever had to walk away from toxic family members to protect your own peace? Have you ever realized that true wealth is simply the absolute freedom to be exactly who you are without ever apologizing? Tell me your story in the comments below. If my personal journey resonated with you, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more authentic stories of surviving toxic families and reclaiming your absolute power. Remember that your peace is the most expensive thing you will ever own, so never let anyone else write the checks for your life.